over the next 30 to 45 minutes, I'm really excited to spend some time unpacking this idea about how great leaders make impactful decisions. Leadership's a topic that I'm passionate about, and I think one of the biggest areas that we can influence our teams and our organizations is how we bring them together to make collaborative and impactful decisions. So over the course of today, hopefully I'm going to be able to share some insights with you that I've gained over my career, both at Kepner-Tregoe and before I've been here. So let's dive into some of the content today. Looking forward to sharing it with you. I think the first thing that we want to level set right up front is making decisions in a leadership environment isn't a new skill. It's really been around the landscape of leadership since the beginning of time. So whenever you think about military conquests or social engineering breakthroughs, industrialization, the digital revolution, none of those things happened in a vacuum. None of those things happened without leaders making decisions. And I think as you start to think through not only the decision-making process, but what comes after that, there's a thread that you can pull through kind of all of eternity that says leaders don't only live and die by their decisions, but how they're able to communicate those decisions, engage people around them, and have people execute on those big decisions that they're making. So it's really a capability that holds true when you think through history, and it's really, really important when the stakes are high, when early outcomes don't look so good, and you're going to need long-term commitment from your team in order to drive success. So today, as we walk through, I want to share with you what our research and history has taught us a bit about how we can put guardrails around our decision-making process that give it better visibility, that help us collaborate more, that help us give our teams a better insight into our key choices. So one of the primary ways we as leaders engage people in a collaborative decision-making environment is we call a meeting and we say, team, come together, we need to talk about this decision that's in front of us. So before we dive into unpacking some of the content today, what I wanted to do was take a quick poll and just understand from you, how much time are you actually spending in meetings per week? So on the bottom of your screen, you should see a poll that comes up where you're able to vote. And that poll should say, how much time do you spend in meetings per week? And you have some answer options: 0 to 5 hours, 6 to 10 hours, 11 to 20 hours, 21 to 30 hours, or 31 plus hours. So as we look at kind of your feedback, a good portion of the group has said, we spend at least 6 hours a week in meetings, if not more. Some of you said, hey, we spend almost 3/4 of our week in meeting, 21 to 30 hours. So if you're wondering, how does that line up with what research shows? Let's dive into that. So research, time spent in meetings per week, the average middle manager across the country spends about 14 hours a week in meetings, give or take. So a little bit over 30% of their time a week in meetings. As you move up into an executive level, that number goes up to 23 hours a week. So more than 50% of a 40-hour work week is spent in meetings. And research that Adam Grant did shows that some companies spend up to 80 hours a week in meetings, 80% of their time a week in meetings. So over 30 hours a week spent in a room or virtually with your peers discussing decisions, discussing initiatives, making choices. And that is a lot of time to spend doing that kind of an activity. So the question kind of remains, so how much of that time is actually productive? So we pulled people into these meetings and we're spending anywhere between 25 and 80% of our lives, work lives in those environments. How much of that time is actually productive? And what research will tell us is most people say, hey, only about 17% of that time is actually productive time that I'm in those meetings. So for the average middle manager, I've spent roughly a third of my week in meetings, and two and a half of those hours are productive time. As an executive, that means about 4 hours, about 10% of my time that is actually productive when I'm with my peers. And in those places where we spend 80% of our time in meeting, my guess is it's probably not even 17%. They're probably on the lower side of that productivity. As a matter of fact, Dropbox is an organization that kind of found that out as their culture was evolving. They said, listen, we've got way too many meetings. So as part of a study, what they did was they canceled all their meetings, all their recurring meetings for a 2-week period. So anything that was on the calendar that was a recurring meeting that would show up day to day, they canceled them for this 2-week period. When they came out of the other end of that 2 weeks, what they found was pretty impressive. The first thing they found was that they were way more effective and efficient without all of the recurring meetings on the calendar. The second thing that they found was that over time, after that 2 weeks, those meetings didn't come back because people realized that they weren't all that effective. So why do we spend so much time talking about meetings? Well, I said it before. That's kind of our primary vehicle for making collaborative decisions. So if we're only spending about 17% of that time being productive, chances are we're not very good at using that time effectively and in a structured way to make decisions. So I want to spend some time today talking a little bit about how do we become better at that. So my goals with you for the next 30 minutes are really to help you do a couple things. One, I want to make sure that we are helping you reduce some of that chaos that happens in your organizations, and we're able to proactively eliminate detractors from those and those preventable things that can derail your decision-making process. I want to make sure that you're able to keep focused. Things that have long cycles, broad initiatives, things that have multi-levels of stakeholders, those things need clarity, vision, and purpose, and we want to make sure that you're able to maintain those. And at the end of the day, I want to make sure that you're able to clearly make visible what's in your head to others. So how can you improve your ability to frame these things up? So you might be thinking today, hey, we're pretty good at this collaborative decision-making process, and I certainly hope for your sake that you're pretty good at it. What I'm really confident in is that over the next 30 minutes or so, you're going to find some tips and tricks that really help you better frame your ideas with your team and become more efficient and effective. So what I wanted to first do was level set the types of decisions that we face as leaders. And I really love the graphic that I found from McKinsey. And I like it for two reasons. One, it doesn't downplay the impact of choices that are familiar and frequent. So when we look at this in terms of scope and impact and how familiar choices are to us, it doesn't say one is better, more, or less impactful than the other. And two, it doesn't assume that new and unique decisions require a sense of analysis. In fact, what this graphic really does is it just buckets decisions into categories that give us a place to start our thinking about how we're going to approach them. So as you look through this A, B, C, D decision-making matrix, I think the first thing you'll notice, I'll start with the A, these ad hoc decisions. These are things that don't happen all that often, but traditionally wouldn't have a large term impact. Things that we see once in a while. So an example of that might be we receive word that there's going to be a maintenance event that's going to temporarily shut down power, and we have to choose how to best communicate during that power outage to our employees. Something we might not have a disaster plan behind, something that doesn't happen often, if ever, before. How are we going to approach that situation on an ad hoc basis? The B, big bet decisions. These are things that have major consequences for your organization. They probably have long-term consequences. An example of that might be we're going to exit a product line that generates significant revenue in favor of something that's new and innovative that we think has a longer shelf life. Big bet decision, chances are it affects a lot of people. That's kind of bucket number 2 that I would put decisions into. The C, the cross-cutting decisions, these things are a bit more familiar to us, and they tend to be a little bit bigger in scope and impact, but we've done them before. So an example of a cross-cutting decision might be, your annual performance review process where you calibrate employees across the organization and allocate bonuses. Doesn't mean that's not an important, broad-reaching decision. It just means it's frequent, familiar, we do it, and we maybe have a process behind it. The last thing then is delegated decisions. These are things that can be assigned to others because as a leader, you don't want to be primarily responsible for them. An example of that might be planning the details of your 15th annual sales conference. Hey, we've done it for the last 15 years. We've got some good boundaries around it. I don't need to be in all the details as a leader. I'm going to delegate this to somebody on my team or a group of people to execute it. I want to be clear here, though. Delegated decisions does not mean that that those decisions don't have oversight. It just means that you're not in the weeds of them every day. When I ran my team in financial services, I delegated decisions to them on a regular basis. And one that pops to mind for me is I said, hey, anytime you're going to spend less than $500 in a given month, you don't need to come to me for approval for that. Because I'd gotten approval requests for things, can I spend $10? Can I spend $50 on this kind of promotion? And I wanted to set some boundaries, give them the ability to make some choices on their own, and give them some responsibility and accountability. So that's an example of a delegated decision that I made. Didn't mean I didn't have oversight into it. It just meant that I gave some boundaries of trust. So now that we've had a chance to kind of look at the types of decisions that we face, we want to take a look at level setting, how we can approach making those decisions. And those really fall into 4 distinct buckets. The first bucket are command decisions. And command decision making is where leaders make decisions really without consulting with their teams. This tends to be an effective decision-making style when things are moving quickly, when the team is looking for immediate guidance. And in a business setting, leaders use this style most effectively in crisis situations. So if we're considering, the types of decisions that might fall under command in a crisis situation, it might be an ad hoc decision, something that just comes up, we haven't seen it before, and we need to quickly turn it around. The B, those big bet decisions, that might be a command decision because we own the outcome of it, and while it's far-reaching in the organization, we still may want to take that responsibility on ourselves, and it might need to be done quickly. And clearly some of the cross-cutting decisions fall into that bucket as well. The second way that we can approach decision-making is through collaboration. And collaborative decision-making is really just what it sounds like. Leaders gather their teams, they request feedback and insight. The leader, in this case, still makes the final call, but they're armed with the proper data to make a more informed decision. So this isn't offloading a decision when you collaborate, but it's simply using your resources of your team in order to better understand the choice and take ownership of that choice. The third way that we can approach making decisions then is consensus-based. And consensus-based decision-making is done more like a democratic vote. Leaders gather their teams and everyone votes, majority rules. This process can work really, really well when the outcome of the decision affects the entire team and it doesn't have an immediate impact on the bottom line. So we've got some time that we're able to have this decision play out in. I think one of the things to note in a consensus-driven decision-making environment is when we think about consensus, we think about people being happy, and that's not always the case. Consensus doesn't mean that everybody's happy at the end of the day. It just means majority rules. So you have to be conscious of that as you're thinking about, is this a time to make a consensus decision? I skipped over convenience, and I did that for a reason, because we just talked a bit about delegation, and convenience is really about that delegated decision, or the D, on the types of decisions that we made on the previous slide. And that's when You're surrounded by some trusted peers. As a leader, you're able to offload some of that decision making. It has some benefits that are associated with it. And one of those benefits are, it gives you a chance to measure the decision-making abilities of your managers or your team. It empowers them, and it helps them really maintain some of their own sanity. So by handing over the decision-making responsibilities, leaders are also building a better management team and a better culture. So we've talked about now the types of decisions that we make as leaders. We've talked about the ways that we can make those decisions. I think it's now really important to talk about, how do we know what's the right way? So how would we choose the right approach to decision making? And there's some research we've done at Kepner-Tregoe that says there's a model, and there's 7 questions that we can ask that guide that process. And those questions are right about 80% of the time. And why are they right about 80% of the time? Because people are unpredictable. And I don't have a crystal ball, and I can't always tell the future. Maybe I make some assumptions that just aren't great up front. But essentially 80% of the time, if you follow this model, you're going to end up in the right place. So let's walk through it a little bit together and talk about what are those 7 questions and how might I know what the right approach is to choose how I'm going to make my decision. I think the first question that we want to ask is there a superior solution? Is there a clear positive or negative path? For example, I'm faced with a choice and there's 2 alternatives, and path B has significant reputation risk and legal risk involved in it. I would answer that question, then yes, there is a superior solution. If it's something that doesn't have, apples to apples, they're almost even, I would say no, there's not a superior solution. There's not a clear differentiator between the alternatives that we're looking at. The second thing I want to answer is then, do I have enough information to make the choice? And this means right now, do I know enough to do this on my own, or do I need to go somewhere and get it? The third question we want to ask is, if I don't have enough information and the answer is no, do I know what information is missing and where to go get that information? As a leader, I might say, yes, I know that accounting is the right place to go get this profit margin information. They're able to produce that for me pretty quickly, and I can get my hands around it. A different example might be, hey, we really need some customer feedback, and I don't know who the right customers are to get this feedback from, and I don't even know where to start. I might need to engage some other people to help me in that. Structure. Question number 4, commitment. Do I need others to effectively implement this? Do I need the help of a team? I was at an organization last week that was really struggling with this question as they were trying to implement some new strategies. So they had a strategy group that was kind of working in a vacuum, developing some really neat, cool ideas and directions for the organization. And on the flip side, we had a field team that felt completely disconnected from the decision making, that it wasn't necessarily meeting their needs. And in order for those things to come together, they really needed the commitment of the field team to execute the strategy. So commitment. Do I need people to implement it? That's the question we want to ask. Question number 5 then is, will people commit without participation? Or, will they come along for the ride if they're not involved in the decision-making process, essentially? Really critical question. Can I make this choice on my own or in a small group environment without including all the key stakeholders? Number 6 is their goal agreement. So between the organization and between the group of people that this decision affects, are we all running in the same direction? Do we have alignment? I see this often with technology implementations, where the goal of the organization is to increase efficiency and effectiveness, and the goal of the group, it's not anti-effectiveness and efficiency. What tends to happen is we don't gather all the requirements the right way, and the organizational goal doesn't happen because the goal of the group isn't taken into account in the design phase. So is there goal agreement? Are we trying to do the same thing as an organization as the group that our decisions affecting? And finally, is there conflict about alternatives? So question number 7. So I get to the point where I've defined the group. Inside that group, is everybody on the same page? Does everybody in the labor union want the same thing? Does everybody in accounting look at this problem the same way and see the same solution? So coming out of those 7 questions then, answering yes or no, we can begin to see those different styles we just talked about take form. So I can take a command approach to some of these decisions. So anywhere you see A1 or A2, where I resolve alone or I just question individuals for information, that's the command approach we talked about before, where I'm not going to involve collaboration, where I'm going to take this on my own and use the information I have to make the choice. Anywhere you see C1 or C2, those are places where we've talked about collaboration. This is where I'm consulting a small group or individuals. And by consult, I don't mean just question, I mean take their opinion to heart and really integrate their opinions, their facts, their data, their wants and needs into that decision-making process, or a group, whether that's a department, a team, a leadership team. We're going to come together and make that decision in a collaborative way. And then finally, anytime you see that G2, you're going to have that consensus-driven decision. If you'll notice, you don't see G2 nearly as much as you see some of the other ones, or some of the C1 and C2 on the screen. Good reason for that. Those decisions take a long time typically to implement. So if you're looking for a way to choose the right approach to decision making, you now have 7 questions that you can kind of go back and ask yourself and decide which approach am I going to take. So we've talked about, on baseline, the types of decisions we make. We've talked about the approaches to decision making. We've talked about how to choose the right approach. So now I want to unpack the concept of putting structure to your decision making. And in my experience, there's really 3 specific use cases for that structure that I'm about to show you. And those use cases are, 1, I want individual clarity. So as a leader, whether I'm making that command decision myself or I need to present a choice or a group of choices to my team, I need to get into a space where I have clarity about what choice am I making, what's important to me, and what does good look like on the other side. The second use case for this kind of structured decision-making approach is when I need to be collaborative. How do I put those guardrails up we talked about earlier to efficiently work with my team? Think back to our conversation around the unproductive meeting time. How do I make my time more productive? How do I get people in the right frame of mind, working on the right things, and make those meetings and that time that we spend together most productive? And then I think finally the third use case is, how do I communicate the outcome of a choice? So how do I tell my story in a way where I can develop champions at the end of this decision-making process and limit detractors? And also, how can we go back and take a look at this in hindsight and make sure that we're keeping that clear focus and vision along the way? So individually, I want clarity. As a group, I want to be able to make sure that I'm collaborating effectively. And then on the backside of it, how do I communicate this? And really, this structured decision-making comes in 2 distinct parts to start out with. First one is defining the choice, truly understanding what is the choice in front of us, how we're going to make it, and then defining the objectives. What's important to me, what's driving this choice, what does good look like on the other side? So under framing your decisions and defining the choice, the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, what is the fundamental purpose? What are we trying to accomplish? Specifically, what recommendation are we trying to make? That's such an interesting question, and one of the places where, as I started to learn this methodology and understand something that maybe you do intuitively, but it takes on a new life form when you're able to do it intentionally. When I sit down and I intentionally think, what do I want to accomplish here? What's the fundamental purpose of this? We all do it intuitively. I think when it's intentional, it brings power to it. The second thing is writing it down. There's a very big difference between what I say and think versus what I see in front of me. It's such an interesting way that we process information as human beings when we see things versus when we just say them and think about them. Even in the production of this webinar, as I thought through these slides, they looked a lot different in my head than when I started to put them on paper and when I started to talk through them after they were in print. So writing it down, making that visible, being able to see it yourself is super important. And then finally, spending some time to review, that choice. So asking questions: what does this address? Is it at the right level? Understanding what are our key assumptions? What prior decisions were made that kind of impact this choice? An example of that was I was talking to the chief operating officer of a mid-sized manufacturing company just earlier this week, and the company was looking to add effectiveness and efficiency to their manufacturing operation. And the easy choice and the clear winner in terms of strict throughput and how do we get operational efficiency in the right place was to add on to their out-of-state facility. They had 200,000 square feet out of state, lots of land to build on, and a really lean manufacturing operation. And unfortunately for this chief operating officer, the owner of the company has said, listen, it's too big of a headache for me to add on out of state. I own the building here in state. There's lots of tax implications for me to sell this building and add on to the one out of state. You're gonna have to figure out how to produce stuff here because I don't want to deal with it. That predetermined choice really now drives some of the decision making this chief operating officer has to do, and how am I going to hit my targets? How am I going to get to this new place? The other thing I think that's really important to do here in terms of defining your choice is understand what's controllable. Acknowledge those things in your control versus those that you don't control. So when I think back to those three use cases, individually defining your choice helps you become more objective as a leader. So as opposed to going into this with some blinders on, when I'm able to ask myself these clear questions, when I'm able to write it down, and when I'm able to reflect on it and review it, I become more objective. From a team perspective, we can be more focused because now I know the choice in front of me. I understand what the assumptions are. I understand what I control. And from a communicative perspective, we can be clear and specific with how we dive into that communication piece. So from framing our decisions, we've moved on to from defining the choice to now defining the objectives. And defining the objectives here, we want to ask things like, what are the benefits and boundaries? What are those things we're trying to accomplish? Write them down. Again, make them visible. Second question we want to ask is, how are we going to measure that? So it's great to have some goals. I want to make sure they're realistic and measurable. So for things that are objective, we might use things like, how much does it cost? How much time? How did we score on that assessment? For things that are subjective, we want to define who's going to be responsible for making the call on what good looks like and put some, again, boundaries around that. Then the third thing we want to determine is those objectives that we've kind of put out there on paper, how important are they? What are our musts? What are our wants? Must in our world, those should be things that are measurable, they're mandatory, and they're realistic. Wants then are those things that are nice to have. They might not be any less important than the musts, but they're nice to have at the end of the day. So when I think about those must criteria, measurable, mandatory, realistic, there are some examples that come to mind where things can be measurable, mandatory, but they can't be realistic. And I'll give you an example of that from my time in financial services. So toward the end of my financial services career, there was some legislation that came down from the Dodd-Frank Act that said you couldn't lend money to people with a certain debt-to-income ratio. That measurable, mandatory requirement was in direct conflict with the Community Reinvestment Act, a different piece of legislation that said banks, you have to lend money to people of low income with higher debt-to-income ratios. So the banks were then really faced with a choice. How do I take these two things that seem to be mandatory and measurable and integrate them into my decision-making process and how we're going to move forward? Those two mandatory things really became one objectives, and you had to weigh out which one was more important. At that time, Dodd-Frank was kind of the hotter regulatory button, so most banks were leaning in favor of taking the more strict approach that Dodd-Frank outlined. So there are times when things can be measurable and mandatory, but not realistic. On the want side then, we really want to understand on a relative basis each of these criteria that we put out in our objectives. How important are they relative to the others so that we can start to make some differentiation between our alternatives? So we've defined the choice, we've defined the objectives. Now the question is, how do I make this visible for myself as a leader? How do I make this visible for my team? How do I make this visible when I want to communicate it? A simple way to do that is to really put it out in kind of this templated graph format. So an example of a decision that some of you might be dealing with right now, selecting an ERP platform for enterprise procurement. You're going to see the things we just talked about on here. You're going to see a decision statement. That decision statement clearly defines what we want to do, and it also sets some boundaries. So you'll notice words like enterprise procurement set a boundary that this shouldn't just work for my department, it should work for the whole enterprise. It allows us to dive into that decision-making objectively and look at it from an enterprise level and not my department level. You see objectives here. What does this choice need to do for us? Well, it needs to be implemented in the next 180 days. It needs to be incredibly flexible. We want to make sure that we're not over-customizing. We want to minimize those things, and we want to be able to optimize those other platforms that we use and how they integrate into this system. Really specifically, we use those words like maximize, minimize, and optimize because they give us ranges for alternatives. So it's really good to think in those range terms versus absolutes when you're with your team, because there might not be one single alternative that is going to drive outcomes. Again, it frames the mindset that you jump into these things with. The next thing you see here, you're going to see measures. And what you don't see, but you would in kind of real life, are then standards behind those. So how are we measuring time to implement? We're going to measure that in days. That's pretty clear. And 180 is kind of the standard for success. Maximize flexibility, number of applications. What's the minimum standard? Well, hey, we need to, in order to be successful here, it needs to have at least 10 supporting applications. You'll see that, those standards alongside these. Number of enhancements, number of direct interfaces. So you see that here. The next thing you see is how do we classify them? Again, must and wants, as we talked about before. That must objective is we've got 180 days. This is mandatory. We have to get this in place in order to drive the rest of our business, and we've got 6 months to do it. That's a must. It's a boundary that we can't get around. The other things are wants: flexibility, customization, optimizing input platforms. We're relatively weighting those against each other. So in this example, we've said, hey, maximizing flexibility is really the most important of those one objectives. And on a scale of 1 to 10, we think that's about an 8. Some really cool things that come out of making thinking visible like this. As a leader, I get a chance to kind of review my thought process. I get a chance to tell my story to my team when I have to bring this in front of them for that collaborative piece of decision making and say, here's where my brain's at strategically. Here's where my brain is at operationally. Check that against your thinking. Check that against reality. Tell me where I might not be correct. When we get into the collaborative piece of this, Your team might come back and say, hey, you know what? When we look at maximized flexibility, number of applications might not be the right measure for us because there's lots of ERP systems that have fantastic amounts of accounting applications that really don't help us on the procurement side. So potentially we need to change that to number of relevant applications and number of procurement applications. That's going to change how we look at some of the alternatives then that come as a result of our research. So we're able to start to have conversations around pieces, components, parts of this, and get the team's buy-in and input around these when we're collaborating. Let's take this example, one step further and say, all right, we've clearly defined the decision we want to make. We've identified what our objectives are. We've now weighted them. Now let's take a look at how do we go through looking at the alternatives that come out of this. I think the first thing to note here is that we're going to get data. We're going to go out and take those alternatives, and we want to get the facts and data behind each of these objectives. It does a couple things. One, it gives us an objective place to start with. And two, it's going to, if the alternatives don't kind of weigh out against our objectives, it helps us minimize the loudest voice in the room or the biggest business card that is screaming, saying, hey, we need to take this path, even if it's not the right path. So getting those facts and data against our objectives, once you've gotten buy-in and agreement that they're the right objectives, really helps minimize that kind of loudest voice, biggest business card syndrome that we see often. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look and screen those alternatives to the musts. Does the data tell us that this implementation, this alternative can meet our must criteria? And in this example, hey, the first and second alternative can be done in 180 days. Alternative number 3 doesn't work out. We're able to clearly eliminate that right away and not spend any more time thinking about it and really hone in on those 2 alternatives that are going to provide potentially some value. From there, we start looking at the want criteria, trying to understand of these, which one scores better. In this example, you're going to see that, hey, alternative 1 meets the must criteria. It's got better flexibility. It's got better optimization for the input platforms. Looks like it's the best choice. We can now objectively say, hey, we've got information that says this is the best choice. But before we dive into really making that decision, we want to make sure that we look at risks. So what's the probability, what could go wrong? What's the probability and seriousness of that going wrong? And based on that information, are we comfortable with it? So now we've taken kind of this nebulous idea of we need to procure an ERP system to we need to procure an ERP system for the enterprise, and here's what our objectives are for that. Here's what good looks like. Here's the alternatives we looked at. Here's how we've measured them objectively, and here's the risks we've looked at. Individually, as a leader, if I have to make a command decision and somebody starts to question my decision making, I can go back and clearly state, here's what I was thinking, here's the assumptions I made, here's the objectives, here's the measures, here's the data. As a group, I can really start to collaborate individually around each one of these items, have spirited discussion in a framed up and buttoned up way. And as I'm communicating to the team, I think what's incredibly important about this approach is, while I may not agree with your decision, I can certainly see the logic behind it. So while it might not be the choice that I would make individually, I can tell a story to folks. I can see, that there was some thought put behind this, and it's not just an edict. It's not just, David Frank saying, here's what I think, and here's how I'm going to drive the business forward. So of everything we've talked about today, I want you to have some takeaways when you leave here, and I want you to start to think about, where can I focus most to be effective? And I love the image that's on the screen because I've lived this personally. I played golf for about 15 years before I took my first lesson. And when I took that first lesson, the instructor gave me about 1,000 things to work on. So the first time I stood over the ball after that lesson, I had all of these swing thoughts rolling through my head and more. to the point where I was almost paralyzed. I couldn't move the club back. I couldn't swing through correctly. And it took me a couple really, really poor rounds of golf and range sessions to come to the understanding that we kicked off this call with, which is, hey, Dave, swinging a golf club isn't something new to you. You've been doing it for a long time. Just like we talked about earlier in the call that, hey, leadership and decision-making and leadership isn't something new to you folks on the call. Chances are if you've been on the call and you've listened to this, it's not because you made a rash of poor decisions in your career and need to make wholesale changes to your approach to decision-making. You've probably done it really well. So just like my golf swing, where I started to focus on individual trigger points, those things that I knew would make significant improvement to my swing, like how did I take my hands away from the ball? I worked on that for a month before I worked on where did I end in my follow-through. I was able to take those trigger points and make small adjustments that had big impacts on the outcome. So what I'd like you to think about today is, what are those trigger points in decision making? What are those things that you self-identified today that you heard me talk about that might be the thing that is going to bring you to the next level as a leader and as a collaborative decision maker? Do I need to stop before I jump into a meeting or brainstorming and help set some boundaries both on myself and my team? Do I need to clearly articulate the why in the form of objectives? Do I need to tell my team what good looks like by setting some boundaries on how we're going to measure things and what those standards are? Do I just need to make my thinking visible because my team always seems confused and can't really connect with what's in my head? Do I need to be a better communicator? Do I need to, help people take that journey with me through why I made that decision? Those are some of the key outcomes that I want you to think about today, and pick one of those and say, how can I get better at one of these key things that's going to help me move my team forward, move my organization forward, become a better leader, become a better decision maker. I think with that, we've got about 15 minutes left that we can spend some time doing question and answer. I thank you for listening to me today. I'm looking forward to your questions and helping with those responses. Kristen, back over to you.
Great. Thanks, David, so much for bringing us through how to use this process to guide decisions as leaders. We do have some great audience questions. Feel free to keep them coming if you have a few after David's just wrapped up here. The first one is it is not always possible to get the entire team to agree on a decision. So is there a threshold, such as a percentage of people who have agreed or disagreed, that can serve as a guideline to making the decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the short answer to that is yes. I think often in business, whether it's through survey results, statistics, et cetera, we use smaller groups as bellwethers for larger decisions. So I think it is possible to, if we have a good cross-section of individuals and viewpoints from the team, we're able to take that and we're able to use, small sample sizes to make larger decisions. I think it happens all the time. And I think it's a good way to do that. What I would caution is that you ensure that you've got the right stakeholders and the right cross-section of people in your decision-making or kind of in that sample to drive your criteria.
Okay, the next one here is, how do you persuade others that a more methodical process is worth the time? That's a great question.
It is a great question, and it's one of the challenges you have in an environment that continues to become faster and faster paced. So one of the buzzwords we often hear today is agile, and agile almost always is followed up by the term quick or speedy, and that's not necessarily the case, right? So it's really difficult in order for us to think about slowing down to speed up. One of the ways to do it is to point out some of the previous failures you've had and how taking some additional time might have saved you from a bad decision. If you are the team leader in this case, and not just the participant, I would highly caution you that you own that. So don't fall into the trap that it needs to get done. When I led my team in financial services, we would spend kind of one full day a month in a team meeting. And many of my peers said, hey, that's way too long to spend in a meeting. And I don't necessarily disagree that that's not a long meeting, but we made sure that time was really, really valuable and really effective. And we didn't bring in outside partners. There was always a clear agenda and a clear set of objectives that we wanted to create. And that time really paid off in incredible dividends, ended up being the number one group in the company over the course of about 18 months. And I credit a lot of that to slowing down, taking the time to build the team, build the relationship, make good decisions, and not punting because it felt like it was a long time. I'd say you own that as a leader.
Great. This is kind of a follow-up, piggybacking to that one. What would you say to the people who will still not get behind a decision after it has been made, regardless of the documentation, the naysayers, if you will?
Yeah, so I think if you look at any sort of good organizational change management theory, somewhere between 7 and 12% of the organization is never going to get behind whatever the change is that you want to make. So I think you have to go in with those clear glasses on that say, hey, we're not going to please everybody, and there's going to be a good 7 to 12% of folks that no matter what I do, they're not going to get on board with this. And I think it warrants some discussions about what's the strategy. How are we going to handle that? Are those people valuable to the organization, and do I need to bring them on board? Are they key stakeholders? Or are these folks, at the end of the day, not that important to moving this forward, and they're going to leave by attrition or, kind of be phased out into a place where their voice is no longer all that important. There's no one single answer to that other than recognize that up front that that's a possibility. Put in as many strategies up front from a change management standpoint as you can to navigate it, and start to leverage some of the other leaders in the organization and see how they might be able to help you influence those folks positively.
Okay, great. So this is another one regarding the trigger point slide. This person asks, do you suggest that we follow the how instructions to determine where we should focus? They say that they're new at their employer and industry and they have so much to learn.
So I'm not sure about the how instructions, which how you're referring to there. So I'm going to take a shot and in the dark and say I would focus on gaining as much knowledge and understanding as you can, asking good questions. So I wouldn't discount your previous knowledge. My guess is you've learned a lot from the other industries that you've been in that certainly can help you in your new environment if you're able to assimilate that information. I'd also go in with a very open mind. Ask some of the dumb questions. Why are we doing this? What assumptions did we make about this? How have you done this in the past? What might I need to know as a new employee? Find a mentor. Find somebody that's going to be able to help guide you through that process and that's going to be okay with you asking those questions. I don't know that there's any really easy way to say, I'm new at my role, I'm new into this industry, I got a lot to learn. The only way I know how to do that is to do some research and ask questions to trusted advisors that are going to help you. Read, study, ask good questions.
Another one here. What if the only alternative that meets the required objective, which I guess is the must, is the worst alternative for all the other objectives? How would you handle that?
That's an interesting question. There's not one answer on how you handle it. So I think the first thing I would say is if we understand what's driving the choice or the decision, and we've acknowledged that there might have been a prior decision made. So if I think about our example where, hey, this has to be implemented in 6 months, That's often an arbitrary number that leadership will give somebody because they think that's when it needs to be done. And when the data comes back in and it's unrealistic, it might be your job to go push back and say, hey, I know you want this done in 6 months, but if there's not a true need for this, it's really gonna handcuff us long term. So I think some of it's really good dialogue by both understanding what those assumptions were going into it and what the outcome needs to be on the other side. Sometimes it's an opportunity for innovation, right? So we've got a number of alternatives. None of them quite meet our need. This might be a chance for us to develop something and really, figure out a way that we can meet our objectives in a new and unique way that the marketplace hasn't thought about before. So I think those are two examples. I'm sure there's 1,000 more ways that you can handle that. Those are kind of my two favorite is pushback with facts and data that say, hey, this isn't the best decision. Can we rework it? Or look for a way to innovate.
Great. Another one here. How do cultural differences play into this process if you're working in a worldwide organization?
That is a really great question, and I think that's one of the key benefits of visibility that maybe we didn't touch on throughout the course of the presentation. When you have cultural differences, there's lots of things that play into how folks respond, what the meaning of words is. So by being able to take this and put it into kind of a structured format where you can read together, folks can start to pick out things that maybe give them a gut check moment. I think the term problem in Chinese has a couple different forms. So when you write it in English and you read it in Chinese, it means different things in our cultures. Seeing that visible on a decision-making matrix or on a slide or on a whiteboard will give us a chance to have the discussion of what does it mean to you versus what does it mean to me. So really that structure and visibility plays a huge role. And again, the boundary setting that happens, understanding minimums and maximums and thresholds that can help frame those different cultures into the right frame of mind to begin with on where we're trying to go. So the visibility, the discussion behind it is really, really important, I think, across cultures. And I think that's a great question.
Someone asks, how can I learn more about the process that you described?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. We clearly spend some time working with organizations, both teaching, consulting, and training folks on how to be better decision makers, how to manage involvement, how to integrate some of this stuff into the performance of their organizations. We'd be happy to spend some time talking to you about that. You can send us an email, ping us on the website, leave your contact information in the chat, and we're happy to get back to you. Another way is there's a book called The New Rational Manager that Chuck Kepner and Kepner-Tregoe wrote a number of years ago that kind of outlined this process and will give you some thought leadership around, how do we make good decision-making work among a number of other topics that are relevant, like how do we troubleshoot and solve problems, how do we manage risk better, et cetera. So those are two different ways I think that you can reach out and learn more about the processes.
This person asks, is it best to work on the things that you need to make a small change on first, or tackle the things that need the biggest change first? And I believe this is regarding the trigger point slide, so meaning things that they need to work on personally.
Yeah, I mean, a very hypothetical question that I'm not sure that I can answer individually for you. What I've found is, just as I've kind of described, if you don't feel like you need a wholesale change in the way that you approach something, then focus on the small things that make biggest improvements. If you say, hey, I need a wholesale change and I really need to blow up everything we're doing because we're just on the wrong path, period, then you might want to take a look at how do I make that wholesale change and redesign whatever that personal process is that I need to go through. So I hate to punt this one, but it's really so situational, you individually, where the guideline for me is really, am I on the right path and just need some improvement, or am I truly walking in the wrong direction and need to turn around?
Okay, great. Thanks so much for your time today, David. Wonderful presentation.